Good afternoon, guys, and welcome to the second COVID vaccine workplace update. It's my pleasure again to welcome back Demetrio Zema and one of his colleagues, Andrew Brooks from lawsquared, who are going to run us through some questions and answers and just, I guess, a bit of information generally about vaccines and rights and wrongs of employers, employees, and so on. If you'd been watching the news this morning, you would have seen the Fair Work Commission has upheld a decision that employers do have the right in certain circumstances to hold their staff accountable. I'm sure that Dee or Andrew will be talking about that a little bit later on. Before we do get started though, Dee, perhaps you could just tell us a little bit about who and what lawsquared is and your role and Andrew's in the organisation.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks so much, Barry. It's great to be back, and thanks so much for joining everyone, because here there's certainly lots of people coming into the webinar, so it's great to be here. So my name is Demetrio Zema. I'm the founder of lawsquared, and Andrew Brooks is an employment workplace relations lawyer with us in our team. We've got a team of 35 across Melbourne, Sydney and Brisbane, working across kind of 4 practice areas. So commercial, corporate, employment and litigation. So primarily work for businesses, corporates, companies, and certainly from an employment workplace relations space, we act for employers. So really important today as we go through the vaccines in the workplace and certainly talking about kind of customers, and we really are focusing from an employer perspective, okay? So we won't really be addressing things from an employee perspective. We'll look at your rights as an employer. We're not going to be addressing rights as an employee. So probably just something really important to flag. But that's us, and we're certainly looking forward to running through this with you, Barry, today.
Thanks, Dee. Thanks, Andrew. I can see we've already got 430 people tuning in, and the number is keeping increasing. So there's obviously a lot of interest in this. If you do have a question, please put it in the Q&A box, not the chat room, so that at the end of the presentation from Dee and Andrew, we will go through and try and answer those questions as well as possible. So Dee, we've just hit 450. Over to you.
Great. All right. Before I hand it over to Andrew, who's going to run through some slides, again, just a couple of caveats. So obviously this is a moving space. And as you said this earlier, Barry, you know, the Fair Work Commission have only this morning come out with some rulings around a flu vaccination scenario. And certainly we know that premiers are every day releasing new information. So this is current as of today, and we'll certainly do our best to provide as much guidance as we can. We may not be able to get to everybody's questions, but we'll certainly do our best. The format will be that Andrew's going to go through a few slides and talk about your rights and responsibilities as an employer, certainly from both an employee perspective, but also we will be touching on what you can do around your customers, your clients, your members. We'll go through some FAQs that we've already been asked over the last few days, and then we'll certainly open the floor for anybody's questions. So again, as Barry said, just make sure any questions you have, don't put them in the chat, put them in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, and we'll go from there. But for now, I'll hand over to Andrew.
Great. Thank you, Demetrio, and thank you, Barry, and for everyone for having me here today. As Demetrio mentioned, I'm just going to be going through the slides today from an employment law perspective, and really just trying to cover off from that angle as much as possible. And then, as Barry mentioned, we'll be going through some Q&As at the end. So please feel free to put them in the Q&A box, and we'll get to them as much as we can. In terms of the agenda for today, we'll first be going through kind of the current landscape with COVID-19 vaccines. As Demetrio flagged, it's changing every day. So we're trying to pull all of that information into what we know right now, but just noting that, of course, in 6 hours it might be different, and then 6 hours after that it might be different again. We'll be going through kind of from a very high level as an obligation for all employers to think about its duty of care, and we're pushing all industry businesses in the fitness industry to actually think about this question. Should we actually have a mandatory vaccination policy for our business, regardless of kind of where you are? I think it's a really important question to ask, but then more importantly, we'll go through whether you can actually do it legally. So there's a lot of information about this. I'll be going through as much as I can, a bit of a step-by-step for you to go through it on your own, and try to land somewhere close to the answer, and then obviously flagging that it's good to get legal advice when we're dealing with these legal issues. We'll look through some of the alternatives to mandatorily requiring vaccines. We'll go through what some of the risks and liabilities are if you are to take it in certain approaches, including mandatory vaccinations. I'll go through some of our top tips. We've fortunately had the ability to to guide and advise on a lot of different clients in different sectors in terms of rolling out their own policy and approach. So we'll go through some of the things we've learned from that. And then as we'll flag, we'll go through a bit of a Q&A at the end. So in terms of the objective, and sometimes it's good to always think about what we're trying to get out of these sessions, really it's just to make sure that you're more informed. If we boil it down to a simplest version, we just want to be able to make sure that you go away from this session having more information that you can then apply to your own business, which means that you're able to be more informed for all of the different things that flow from that. It also means that when we're getting new information through from governments in terms of what they're requiring, it then allows us to more easily kind of funnel that through to what we're going to do as a business. In terms of the current landscape, I definitely don't want to kind of go through too much of this, and people have spoken about COVID-19 so much, especially over the last 24 months. So just really keen to flag that we are in a unique situation at the moment. So we are seeing case numbers across Australia, mostly due to Victoria and New South Wales really peak compared to a lot of our other waves. We are seeing the age profile of people that are contracting COVID-19 change, and we're seeing a lot less from that older demographic, and we're actually seeing a lot more from that 20 to 40 age graphic that you can see in New South Wales. Importantly for this is a lot of our workforce. As employers, a lot of our employees fall into that range. So it's just good to know that this isn't something that just affects older or younger, it actually does affect our workforce. And you can see that below in terms of who's actually acquiring as well. The highest numbers are those between that 20 and 40 mark. We're also seeing vaccination targets obviously get set and they're not necessarily met. So we've got that line going up there in terms of when particular numbers might get met, but that's actually coming down as we're seeing vaccine intake actually increase. So if we were kind of go back to away from the stats and just look at kind of what's happened so far. Federal government obviously came out with their plan for the entire nation to be vaccinated by October of this year. New targets kind of came out to revise those, but they're potentially looking at about 80% of the population over 16 to be vaccinated by December of this year. So pushing back a couple months. And it's also just worth noting, you know, there's a lot of talk about people being nervous about getting vaccines or not going ahead with vaccines, but we are actually getting a very high uptake of people getting the vaccine, and 80% by December is not that long away from now. We're also getting the ability for basically all Australians over the age of 12 now being eligible to receive one or both COVID-19 vaccines. Obviously, appointment availability changes state to state, but we are seeing it readily available for nearly everyone over 12, which is obviously different to what it was about 1 or 2 months ago. In July, we also had an indemnity scheme introduced for health professionals by the government to provide better security for doctors to recommend the COVID-19 vaccines. And then also in August, we had the no-fault COVID-19 vaccine claim scheme, which hasn't technically been introduced formally yet, but the government has announced, and you can put in an interest into that, which covers individuals in terms of any adverse reactions to the vaccine. So we're already seeing kind of particular things get put in place to better encourage people to get the vaccine. We obviously already know that New South Wales and Victoria have released their roadmaps, and they are different. There are some similarities, but they are different in terms of where the states are in terms of the vaccine rates, and then also what they're going to do in the fitness industry. So this is information that, you know, is readily available this morning, but as Demetrio flagged, it could change tomorrow. So I won't go through it in any great detail, but for the purpose of New South Wales, we're looking at potentially 11 October, gyms being able to operate with vaccinated people per square metre, so at different density quotas, capped at 20. And that's only for vaccinated individuals, 80%, that increasing further. And then 1 December, regardless of whether you're vaccinated or not, there are different caps that will come in at that point too. So they're all linked to vaccination rates, which means that those dates aren't necessarily locked in. We also don't know a lot of information in terms of New South Wales, in terms of how this will all work. So how people will be forced to check vaccination statuses. There is a trial going on at the moment. But we don't necessarily know the nuts and bolts of that. So these are just target numbers. This is the roadmap information that we have, but we'll hopefully be able to get more information very shortly in terms of how it will actually get implemented. In Victoria, at the moment, outdoor personal training is allowed with certain numbers, and then it's a higher number if you're from the same household and you've all received double doses. And then approximately 5th of November, there should be more freedoms put forward for the fitness industry. So fully vaccinated can attend gyms indoors with certain density quotas, and then outdoors with even larger quotas. So again, this is just what we know at the moment. It will change. There will be more put through in terms of implementation on the practical side, but just to flag that we have these targets at the moment. The issue, I guess, and what I'm really trying to hone in on today from an employment law point of view is this particular issue. So Scott Morrison, as our Prime Minister, came out in August 2021 and actually made it really clear that in terms of businesses putting forward their own mandatory vaccine policies, it's actually on them to work that out, and it's actually on them to take on that risk. So that, as you can see on the slide, it's not intention of the government to create any special laws for employers, and they're actually just recommending that employers seek their own advice. So very disheartening and I guess frustrating for a lot of our businesses in the fitness industry that they need to go at this on their own, but we'll go through kind of how you can do that, but just to flag, there isn't kind of a one-size-fits-all approach. And if the government hasn't come in and required your employees to be vaccinated, then it is actually your decision as to whether you go ahead with it, and it is your risk that you'll be taking on if you do introduce a mandatory vaccination policy. So just again, kind of flagged at the very beginning, should all businesses consider a vaccine stance? I think the answer has to be yes. I'm not saying that all businesses in the fitness industry should go ahead with a mandatory vaccination policy. I'm definitely not saying that, but I really do think it's important for the leadership group at each business to sit down and think about it, because in each state and territory, you've got obligations under the different OH&S obligation legislation or WHS legislation, because you've got a duty of care to all of your employees and people that come onto your sites. But you also have an obligation to make sure that you've taken all reasonable steps to provide a safe environment, especially for your employees. So we've got these big obligations in terms of OH&S that we just need to be mindful of. And given COVID-19 is something that's going through a lot of our areas, it has to be part of our risk analysis in terms of, do we need to implement something to protect our people? It is largely an obligation on employers. Technically, employees do have an obligation to look out for their own safety, and they owe a duty of care to other people. So they do have those obligations, but it largely falls on the employer. So liability, when we see this brought up, is when employers have not looked at their OH&S responsibly and then have faced either financial penalties, negligence claims, reputational damage, an uptick in workers' comp claims that we're seeing a lot recently, and then in certain states, actual criminal convictions. So it is an obligation that we need to take really seriously. And even though, as I said, it might not mean that everyone needs to introduce a mandatory vaccination policy, I really do think that everyone should at least consider the question and then come to a yes or no decision. So I guess the million-dollar question at the moment, and why employment lawyers are so popular right now, is can we actually legally direct our employees to get vaccinated? And there are three ways that we can actually go through this and know that for sure we can do it. And I'll just go through them now. Number one, if the government comes out and actually says that your employees just must get vaccinated, then it's really a clear situation. So we have people that we know at employee representative firms, and they're telling people to come to them that they've really got no claim if their employer is actually forced to make sure that they're vaccinated. So we're looking at construction in Victoria, we're looking at the fitness industry, potentially in New South Wales and Victoria coming up. If the government comes in and just requires it, then it's really not up to us. We just have to comply with that direction. We can't just say no to a government direction and then do what we want. It's actually out of our hands completely. And in some ways, that's actually a good thing from an employment law perspective, because it actually is very hard then for the employer to come in and say that we did something unfairly. So first one that's as clear as day, if the government comes in and says your employees must be vaccinated, or your employees must be vaccinated to be on site, we just have to follow that direction, and it makes this issue a lot simpler, because it's not our direction, it's really the government's direction. And though it sounds a little bit flippant, but if employees come to you and they disagree with that direction, then really their only avenue is to go straight to the government and lobby or try to get that direction changed. But it's actually not on us as employers. We just don't have that ability. The second time when you can require vaccinations is if it's actually set out in your enterprise agreement or an employment contract that they need to have it. So a lot of our employer clients at the moment are actually considering putting in their employment contracts for new employees that they're required to be vaccinated. I would recommend, if we do this, that there's an actual reason for it. So, for example, if they're in the fitness industry, that it's likely they'll need it, they'll be in closed spaces, there's that heightened risk. So you've actually got grounds to require it. But we are seeing that a lot, because if it's in their employment contract, it's actually much safer to then direct them to get it, because they've already agreed to do it when they sign the document. The big $1 million question, though, comes to number 3. So you can require it even if 1 and 2 don't apply, if it's a lawful and reasonable direction. So we're looking at states that don't have mandatory vaccination stances at the moment from governments. We're looking at even New South Wales and Victoria between now and when those things come in. We're in this kind of area where there's no government, there's no employment contract likely, and we need to work out whether we can do it, and that will be based on whether it's a lawful and reasonable direction. So lawyers love the word reasonable because it's really what we do when we don't want to create a black and white law on it. And it requires the courts to actually look at your particular circumstances. And that's what I mean by it's unfortunately not possible for one whole sector to have a yes and no answer to something. It's actually going to be based on your particular business. So what is lawful and reasonable for one company, as I put in the slides, it may not actually be lawful and reasonable for another. So work that out. A court will look at the background leading up to that direction. So what's the state of play? And they'll be looking at the slides that we potentially put forward in terms of vaccination rates and what are the risks associated with that. They'll be looking at kind of what was the objective of that direction. So what were you trying to achieve by putting in that direction? What were the risks you were worried about? They'd look at, were there any available alternatives? So for some clients that don't actually have that face-to-face contact, an alternative may just be that they work from home, or that they have particular social distancing in place. It may be that there are other alternatives besides from vaccinations. And then they'll look at what the impact is of the direction on others. So they'll look at kind of what was the impact of that direction, not only for employees, but also for others involved as well. There's some guidance that's been released by the Fair Work Ombudsman in terms of this whole process, but it's just guidance at this point. We actually don't have cases that go through it one by one and tell us exactly how they're going to look at it. It's just so early into the piece. And I've put on the slide a couple of cases that were found this year. They were to do with the flu vaccine. So I won't really go through them for the purpose of this, but just to highlight that we just don't have cases on this as yet. So even the case referred to earlier that came out today, that was a rejection of an appeal, but that was to do with the flu vaccine. So I would just say that cases have come forward in relation to the flu vaccine that have been found actually in the favour of the employer. So it actually backed up the employer's ability to require vaccination. But I would just say that we can only take that with a grain of salt at the moment, purely because it's not related to COVID-19, and we will be seeing cases come forward. But in this interim stage, we are actually left a little bit in the grey until we get that more kind of run through the court system. So I kind of hate it when lawyers kind of say, look, everything's in the grey and so it's hard, and so just come to us. I'd rather take you through kind of our step-by-step approach that we recommend businesses go through, just to kind of get you through a large part of it. I will caveat, there is a step in there to seek legal advice, because it is one of those areas where you do want something to rely on. But again, I want to be able to leave you here today with able to make a bit more of an informed decision and get a lot of the way there. So in terms of step one, so if you're a business that's trying to work out if you can introduce a mandatory vaccination policy and there is no government direction already in, first step is to categorise your employees. So Fair Work Ombudsman came out and they really said that the risk profile changes depending on what sort of work your employees are doing. So it's quite simple. Just go through each of these tiers and then put all the employees in there, or the roles that you think covered under them. And at the end of that, you'll have, say, none in tier 1, a few in tier 2, a few in tier 3, for example. And that will just give you a really good starting point to work out what contact they have with others, because that will largely dictate our ability to then introduce a mandatory vaccination policy. For example, if they're a tier 4, and there's minimal face-to-face interaction and they just work from home, for example, then it's going to be quite hard to introduce a mandatory vaccination policy, because it's hard to say that they're at risk to others by not being vaccinated. Where if they're more in terms of tiers 1, 2, and 3, where they do have that contact, then obviously the risk is higher. So that's important to know. The next step is just to acknowledge that COVID-19 is unfortunately not the same everywhere. In Victoria and New South Wales, obviously the risks of contracting COVID-19 are much higher than they are for, say, in Western Australia. So it is really important that create subgroups under each of those tiers that separate where they're working. So if you're a national organisation and you've got gyms everywhere, for example, this is more important for you. If you've only got one particular centre in one particular area, then this will be really easy to cover. But just to separate that the risks are actually changing depending on where we are. And this also just highlights that we need to be constantly reviewing this, because although, we don't see COVID-19 as big a risk in Queensland, for example, there was that report of a case, and then if that ballooned up, then we do need to take it more seriously. So just to take a really sophisticated approach to mandatory vaccination policies requires us to look at the areas in which our employees are. Now that we've kind of got these subgroups, so we've got it based on their tiers and then based on where they live and where they work, we then just need to analyse each subgroup. So we need to look at what is the risk of COVID-19 for that subgroup. So what's the community transmission in that area, for example? New South Wales and Victoria, it's pretty easy to say it's really high. Western Australia, it's pretty easy to say it's almost non-existent. We'll be needing to look at what's the risk of COVID-19 for the people that the subgroup interact with. So are the people that come into those centres, are they particularly vulnerable? Do we have a large age demographic that goes higher? Do we have people that are potentially immunocompromised? Are we dealing with people that could come in and then be at more risk of getting COVID-19 or the harsh reactions from it? We need to look at our vaccinations even available for that subgroup. Now, this is not as big a deal now as it was 2 months ago, where it was hard for some people to be able to get a vaccine. This is largely not the problem at the moment, but it is worth just noting and looking into it, because it's hard pressed to say that you must get vaccinated if they actually just can't get an appointment. Last step is to look at alternatives. So is it an inherent requirement of the role to be physically there? Or could we potentially look at them working remotely? Could we manage that risk with split shifts, for example? Is social distancing enough? We may go through this and work out the vaccines are the only way to protect our people, but it is still worth going through and actually looking at, are there any alternatives? So hopefully by the time you get to this stage, you've got a pretty good idea in your own head about whether you could introduce a mandatory vaccination policy just based on those subgroups, based on looking at what the risks are, based on the alternatives. But if you are going to go ahead with a mandatory vaccination policy that's not backed up by government direction, I would recommend seeking legal advice. So we've already seen SBC come out a month ago with their mandatory vaccination policy. And the first thing they did from a reputational point of view was say, we got legal advice and we're relying on that. So I just think it's a really important step if you are to go through with something, and we will go through the potential risks of an approach that's mandatory. It's just making sure you've got the comfort in the drawer that says that what you're doing is actually correct and legal. That is a really quick way of going through, I guess, that legal thinking process. Part of what we see that often doesn't get followed through is this implementation side. So we're actually looking at, so say we've made a decision to implement a mandatory vaccination policy, what does it actually look like in practice? And are we asking the right questions now instead of trying to fit it through later? Because although it's very easy to just send out an email saying you must be vaccinated by this date, there are actually a lot of other things that we just need to be mindful of to really put this through properly. So we'll put down some questions on the slides for your leadership group to go through, but and I'll run through them quickly now. But in terms of when will you require compliance? So all vaccines require a first shot and a second shot. And so when are you requiring each shot to be completed by? What are you going to do if someone refuses? So it is our recommendation that if there's any refusal of a mandatory vaccination policy requirement, that you actually meet with them and try to work out what's going on, have that discussion, set out exactly why you're requiring it, try to get information from them on why they're not going to comply, and work out why they're not going to comply. If it's principle, that might be one way that you deal with it. If it's on medical grounds, that may be another. But it is really important to know from the outset, what's your process for when people don't comply? Because if it's a lawful and reasonable direction, so you've gone through that step, legal advice says it is, then you can actually take disciplinary action against anyone that fails to follow a lawful and reasonable direction. So it may be that you give them a first warning after the first failure, you might stand them down without pay if you need them to be vaccinated for that until they do get vaccinated, or you might even go down further and say that this is a second breach of a lawful and reasonable direction, and therefore we're actually considering terminating your employment, get their response, and then consider if you've got grounds to terminate. But we are going to see a lot of our businesses actually go through with a lawful and reasonable direction, and then unfortunately inevitably result in employees being let go because they're just failing to follow that direction. So it is just even more important, if we want to be able to do that, to make sure we've lined everything else up before it to make sure it's as lawful and reasonable as possible. Another question will be, is it a global policy or targeted to certain employees? I really recommend, just like I did before in terms of those subgroups, to think about this in terms of particular groups of employees rather than just a one-size-fits-all. Just because it's really rare, in my opinion, that we'll be able to have companies come out with just a complete everyone must get vaccinated no matter what you do, no matter where you are, no matter what you're doing. It is going to be most likely the case that you are going to have to target who you're requiring to be vaccinated, who isn't. But, we are seeing clients still come out with global policies in some situations, but it's good for you to know exactly whether what your stance is on that point. In terms of evidence, so if you require people to show that they've got vaccinated, how are you going to actually require that? What information will you need? And then how will you actually store that? So we'll go through it in a little bit, but you've got obligations from a confidential information point of view and a privacy point of view about handling vaccination status information. So we need to really think about that process before we then just start asking. We will see, as especially New South Wales and Victoria, ways to provide evidence of vaccination status. I know the MyGov app already provides that at the moment, and we may get other ways for people to show that in a particular way, but at the moment, we can really only ask for the information that can be available. And so just putting thought into exactly what we're asking for. And then also, is there any resourcing we need to take or be mindful of? It's great if we think we can introduce a mandatory vaccination policy, but if we make the requirements say this Friday and there's no way for them to get vaccinated by then, do we actually have people to cover the people that aren't vaccinated? So these are all the implementation stage questions that we just need to really be mindful of before we go ahead with an approach. Otherwise, we're just going to issue something and then kind of scramble to make sure it works. Next step is kind of put in writing. So it is really important, if you've gone through all that step and you are deciding to introduce a mandatory vaccination policy, it's really vital that you actually have something in writing you can send out. So this will set out all of those different implementation steps that we just spoke about. So covers timelines, covers that it's a direction, not a request. It confirms what happens if they don't comply. So being really transparent in terms of those steps and whether that's stand down without pay or disciplinary action, including up to termination. These are the things we really need to be careful of. We need to set out what evidence that you require from them. And then we actually need to provide them with an opportunity or avenue to raise concerns or questions. I think companies that approach this in a very narrow, this is how it is, otherwise this is what's going to happen, with no ability to question, no ability to raise concerns, I think are really going to struggle. And they might actually lose that relationship between their employees, even for the ones that are already vaccinated. They just might find that emotionally, the way that they dealt with and communicated was wrong, and they might lose a lot of that goodwill that would just be a really unfortunate situation. We've kind of already touched this already, but if someone refuses, if it's a lawful and reasonable direction for them to get vaccinated, then you can actually just treat it like any other lawful and reasonable direction. So I would still recommend you meet with them, try to work out more about what's going on, try to work out why they're refusing to follow it, and then be really clear with them in terms of what happens next. So if they're saying they've got medical grounds for not being able to get it, I would definitely consider asking for medical evidence to support that, and so you can have a further conversation about it. If they just don't want to comply, then you've got the ability to actually consider disciplinary action against them. And whether that's issuing them with a warning and then directing them again to get it, or going straight to that disciplinary action stage, these are options available to you. So it is just really worth going through all of these steps, communicating really well, trying to be as transparent as possible, and then at that stage, considering what you want to do. And of course, you can seek advice if you're not sure about exactly how to go through that. In terms of the evidence requirements, as I said, we've kind of got MyGov at the moment that provides a snapshot, but I would really recommend businesses to consider, at least at this stage, to just set forward that you just need reasonable evidence to verify their vaccination status. We just don't want employees thinking that you're overreaching and asking for more than you need. I'd rather put it on them to provide that evidence to you. If they're comfortable with a MyGov screenshot, great. If they'd rather do a stat deck, which says exactly how they got it and where they got it, then that should be okay too. We just want it to be reasonable evidence that we can then know that they've had the vaccine. We then just need to be careful because it's sensitive information. Vaccination status potentially could be health information. We just need to make sure we secure it at all times, make sure our privacy policy is up to date, make sure that we don't hold it for any longer than we need to, and to just make sure we limit what we're actually storing to exactly what we need. There's no need for us to store additional medical information for eternity. If we're just looking at mandatory vaccination policies, then we should just keep it to the information we're asking. Now, in terms of alternatives, because it may be that you went through that 4-step process and worked out that we probably can't require vaccinations at the moment from our employees, but to be honest, we may in the future and would rather try to get them as vaccinated as possible in the interim. And there are particular ways you can try to do that. So if you can't direct, then one option is to release a statement or policy that strongly encourages them to get the COVID-19 vaccine. And there is a link on lawsquared's website for what this particular wording can look like. We have a sample COVID-19 strongly encourage vaccination policy up there, so you can see how you can deal with particular wording. The other option is to provide incentives to employers to get COVID vaccine. So I'll go through each one. There are some particular things for each that we just need to be careful of, but this is considered more of the softer approach. So it's not doing nothing, but it's also not requiring vaccine. It kind of falls somewhere in the middle. So in terms of incentives, it's weird. The TGA, Therapeutic Goods Association, has come out and actually do require or have certain rules about how we can incentivize people to get the COVID-19 vaccine. And they're not that controversial, but we just need to be mindful that we need to comply with them. So it just changes in terms of how we can communicate incentives, when those incentives can be triggered, and then what we can actually provide as an incentive. So in terms of the communications, we just need to make sure they're consistent with the government advice. We need to make sure there's a reference to get advice from a medical practitioner. So it's not on us to make any comments about the COVID-19 vaccine. It's not on us to make any comments about one vaccine versus another. Purely the recommendation is to just seek advice from a medical practitioner. It's actually great for us because we shouldn't be giving advice on that anyway. And it's actually the law now that we need to just refer them on. We need to be inclusive with any incentives. So if someone has already been vaccinated, then we should provide the same incentive benefit to them, regardless of whether they were previously vaccinated or not. And then again, to not preference one vaccine over another. So we shouldn't be making any comments that AZ is better than Pfizer or vice versa. That's not our role. We just need to refer to it as a COVID-19 vaccine, and it's up to them in terms of which one they get based on medical practitioner advice. In terms of monetary incentives, we just need to, the only weird thing about it is we just need to make sure that we only provide it when they're fully vaccinated. So there is this requirement that if we are going to be giving, say, a cash bonus or a gift card, that we actually wait until they've gotten their second dose. And it's actually unlawful to provide it after the first one. It sounds kind of technical and peculiar, and it is, but it is the rule that we need to follow. So if we are providing those benefits, just make it after the triggering of the second vaccine rather than just the first dose. And we can really provide anything as an incentive, except weirdly for alcohol, tobacco, and medicines. It's just something that we can't provide as part of it. So probably not likely to be something you were considering, but just to flag that there are those things that we can't do. And as mentioned before, with our incentives, if they've already been vaccinated when we introduce an incentive scheme, we should just make sure that they're covered by that anyway. So retrospectively applies. This is consistent with TGAs. It's also likely to restore that relationship with the employee who might feel punished for actually being more proactive than your other employees. So just a really safe thing to do, just make sure it's retrospective. Now, in terms of the potential risks and liabilities, and this is where obviously lawyers get involved and try to avoid these, but there are risks. If we were to introduce a mandatory vaccination policy, there could be a potential if we then go down a disciplinary route and terminate an employee's employment, they might say that we've actually breached our obligations. So really quickly kind of going through what are the potential risks for us. We could see a discrimination complaint if they believe that we've actually discriminated against them on a basis of a protected attribute. So each state has their own different discrimination commission, such as the VEO, HRC in Victoria. And that's similar with a discrimination complaint at the federal level at the Australian Human Rights Commission. So it will just be a claim, and we may see this come through that, you know, I had medical grounds for not being able to get the vaccine, but you still terminated my employment, or, you know, you've denied me entry because of, say, religious basis, and they might go through with a discrimination complaint against you. So again, I guess this is why it's really important to go through that initial stage instead of just kind of rolling out a policy without necessarily thinking about it. We're also going to see general protections claims come in. So they'll say that we took adverse action against an employee, we terminated their employment on the basis of a protected attribute. So we've already seen cases come through in relation to the flu vaccine, saying that they couldn't get it because of particular medical information or because they just didn't want to. And then a claim comes through saying that it was unfair or it was unlawful when we terminated their employment. And that's going to be the same for an unfair dismissal claim, just saying that it was harsh, unjust or unfair for us to terminate in those situations. In terms of what that level of risk is, it will depend on whether our original direction was lawful and reasonable. So it isn't something I can say that you'll definitely be able to be fine or you'll definitely not be. But if you go through that 4-step process, you'll be in a really strong position to then defend these claims if you've gone through that process properly. In terms of our top tips and recommendations, I'm just conscious to try to get through these slides because I know that there'll be a lot of questions to come through, but really recommend as a first tip, sit down with your leadership group, go through that 4-step test and try to work out what the position is in terms of the business. So are we going to introduce a mandatory vaccination policy, or are we going to do nothing? Or are we going to do something in between, such as strongly encourage or provide incentives? Next step is to consult with your employees. So you do have obligations under different legislation to actually consult about different occupational health and safety things. So if you are to introduce a policy, I'd recommend consulting first on it. It might be sitting down with your employees in a group, having a Zoom call with everyone to just set forward that you're proposing to introduce it, take on that feedback, consider it, and then make a final decision. I'd much rather you do this before you release the policy as a final version, just so it can be seen that you are actually consulting. The tip is to remember privacy and confidential information. And this is from a legal point of view in one part in terms of complying with your different obligations legally, but more importantly, I think it's that communication piece. You know, your employees will be trusting you to take on that information in terms of their vaccination status and storing that and just keeping that secure. And I think that we're really going to lose out in terms of that relationship if we actually do that poorly. So I think it's really important to just give them comfort that you're only collecting exactly what you need. This is how it's going to be stored. This is how it's going to be kept. This is how it's going to be secure. It just makes that communication a lot better because it isn't overreach in terms of asking for it and storing that. It just to make them feel confident about why you're collecting it. It's similar to, for example, if someone took personal leave and provided a medical certificate, they just need to be comfortable that you're not then just sharing that around to everyone. I then just recommend, and it sounds kind of classic law, but just to review everything really regularly. As mentioned before, things change very quickly, if not daily, maybe hourly. And so a mandatory vaccination policy that makes sense now may not actually make sense in 3 months. If vaccination rates go up so high that the risk of COVID-19 is actually very, very small, it may mean that we actually can't require our employees to get vaccinated because that risk is so small. Where on the flip side, if COVID-19 goes worse in different states than it is at the moment and vaccine rates stay lower, it might mean that we can introduce a policy in December, for example, but we couldn't introduce it now. So I'd really recommend if we do introduce any approach, to just regularly review it and then make changes as we go, because as we say, we just need to consider the government information when it comes in and then make those corrections. Next step is just to protect the business with documents. So I've already kind of mentioned, but a vaccination policy just puts you in a much better position to set out all the different practical sides and make it really clear what they have to and what they can choose to do. Also think about future planning. If you're a gym and hiring new employees, for example, consider whether we want to make it a requirement of their employment for them to get the COVID-19 vaccine, and think about whether you want to put that in their PD as well, so that when they come on board, you're really transparent in terms of what's required of them, so that they agree to it and don't then raise an issue later. These are all the different things we can do from a document standpoint that will put your business in a much stronger position rather than simply just issuing a verbal command. And the classic caveat of a lawyer. So seek advice if you need it. This is one of those really controversial areas where we're going to see a lot of pushback from employees in terms of whether they do follow through or not on it. And if you've got legal advice that says it's a lawful and reasonable direction, then it actually just provides you with the comfort that you can proceed with disciplinary action if you want to, you can proceed with stand downs. Otherwise, you're in this position where you're kind of hoping that you were right, and then you're not actually sure what the risks are. So you're not able to make that informed decision. So really recommend kind of seeking that legal advice if you are seeking to introduce a mandatory vaccination policy, and particularly if you're looking to then discipline someone for not following it. So I might just hand over to Demetrio again to go through some of the FAQ questions that have already been put forward, and then I'll open up the floor to everyone so we can go through some more of the Q&As that have been put through on the box.
Thanks, Andrew. I have been busily working away at some of those Q&As, but I think I'm getting more than I'm answering. So there's just a couple of FAQs that we have put here, and then certainly we'll do our best to go through some of those questions. I've already got some common themes which we will deal with. So the first one is around the government roadmap mandates that only vaccinated employees and vaccinated members can exercise and attend a facility. Do you have to comply? Again, as Andrew kind of has outlined, then yeah, the short of it is yes. Unless you want to be subject to a fine for breaching Chief Health Officer orders, or be subject to negative publicity. I mean, this is the other thing to think about. We know that the anti-vax, or those who don't want to be vaccinated, they may not be anti-vax, contingent are quite vocal, but actually we now have, particularly in New South Wales, almost 80, and we're likely to hit 90% of people who are vaccinated. So we actually have a vast majority of people who are supportive of vaccinations. So ultimately, yes, if the government roadmap mandates it, then yes, you should. Just going to the next slide. If members or clients, so there's been obviously, this has been a focus on employees and employers, but we have had lots of questions around members. And I've just answered a number of them then. But if a member or client wants to participate in activity, however, they are not vaccinated, then again, you must follow the current rules. So a number of people in the chat box have said, well, it's not law. What is law? What is legislation? Under state of emergency laws in both Victoria and New South Wales, and certainly across the country, chief health officers have the right to issue directives which do carry penalties. So they are in fact deemed as something that is enforceable. So that is obviously very different to legislation or regulations or schemes which are formally passed through Parliament. However, the state of emergency rules do allow for each state to essentially issue directives which are enforceable. And that's something really important to understand. And we may disagree with various chief health officer orders or directives, or governments or premiers making kind of daily statements that we may not agree with, but they are able to issue those directives under the current rules. So again, if clients and members don't participate, then the current rules and certainly the roadmaps do require that only vaccinated individuals can train and be trained. So you also, as a trainer, if you are the trainer or the gym owner or fitness studio owner, need to be vaccinated in order to deliver that service. To the next one, Andrew. In terms of refunds, so there's a couple of questions there around, well, what if I have unvaccinated people who want refunds, or what if there are prepaid packages? What happens there? Unfortunately, you either have a business decision, which is you can keep things on hold, similarly as you could stand down your unvaccinated staff until the rules change. You could also ask your members to just put their memberships on hold until those rules change, or you could consider a refund. But ultimately, you need to decide what the best business decision is. A lot of the questions have been around, do I have to do this? Do I not have to do this? You need to make the right business decision for you. Post 1 December in New South Wales, and we anticipate this is going to be likely around the same period of time in Victoria, you need to decide what your business is going to require. And that's not a legal direction, but ultimately your customers, your clients, or your members may help you decide that. And that's something that you need to actively consider. Last one is, what if a member of a client wants to cancel their membership due to mandatory vaccination requirements, which you are then forced to also comply with? Unfortunately, the answer is going to be it depends. And I know Andrew made a joke about that before. And as lawyers, it's not that we have fence sitting, but it really does depend. What do your terms and conditions look like? What does your membership agreement look like? Does it deal with the scenario? Probably not. I'd be very impressed, but also very surprised if anybody in their membership agreement has anything relating to vaccinations. But some options, you could either sit to suspend until the rules change, you could give a refund, or you could just force the ongoing membership, which wouldn't be the recommended approach, but certainly something that you could do. So again, they were just some high-level FAQs, and hopefully we dealt with some of the questions. And I know I typed some others and dealt with the other common themes that I was answering whilst Andrew was talking. But Barrie, maybe over to you, just pick a couple of the highlights in the time we've got left.
Yeah, thanks, Dee. And just for the benefit of the people that are participating in this webinar, I asked the host to turn the chat room off. Some of the conversation that was going on in the chat room wasn't relevant to the presentation. We've got two guys here who have volunteered their expertise and time to come and speak to you to share their knowledge. This is not the opportunity or the appropriate timing, in my view, for an argument about whether we should or should not be vaccinating. That is not the context of this discussion. I'd also point out to you that Fitness Australia doesn't support mandatory vaccination. We do support every member of the community considering getting vaccinated once they've had the appropriate conversation with their particular medical authority. However, I was interested to hear Andrew pick up I don't know if anyone else picked up on this, but Andrew made a comment during his presentation that there is a possibility that vaccinations will be made mandatory for our sector. Now, we have not heard anything to that to, I guess, support that view, but I haven't heard anything to actually dismiss that view either. And in fact, when you look in the situation in Victoria, where they've actually increased the number of sectors that do have to be mandatory vaccinated now, I don't think it's necessarily impossible, given the nature of our business, that we are caught up in that and we do have to go through a mandatory vaccination. Obviously, if we have a number of transmission outbreaks in our facilities when we do open, that is going to be absolutely like a red rag to a bull. And that will be, I think, probably persuade any chief health officer to actually make it mandatory. So just a little hint there, guys, when we're back open again, please do the right thing and make sure we're doing everything possible to at least minimise or mitigate the potential for transmissions in our gyms. We know about the negative commentary that's been coming from some chief health officers over the last 18 months. Some of them may be looking for any excuse. So I just sort of put that on notice. Okay, so let's try and get through some of these questions. We have a lot of them here, Dee and Andrew, but I had two questions from staff. One, being vaxxed is not part of my job that I was employed for. Why should I get vaccinated? If I was injured as a result of a forced vax, as a result, who pays some medical bills?
Yeah, great. So happy to jump in there. Just on the first one, it will be very rare, unless you've just been very smart about it, for a PD to set out requirements around COVID-19 vaccines. What I would be looking at, though, is are there requirements for them to be physically at certain locations, or is it an inherent requirement of the role to be at the gym or be on site? Because if that is, then it actually is relevant for them whether or not they have the vaccine in certain situations. So if you do get pushed back in terms of the PD, I'd just then look at, well, it's an inherent requirement of your role to do X, Y, Z, and that's how it relates now to the COVID-19 vaccine. So it doesn't necessarily need to be in a PD specifically for you then to be able to lawfully direct them to get it. Obviously, there are those other factors to consider as well. For the second part, as I flagged, the federal government has released a indemnity scheme or a liability scheme for people to go through if there are adverse actions to the vaccine. So it wouldn't be an employer situation normally that would cover it. It would actually be people putting through to this scheme and trying to get compensation through that. So that's, I guess, the whole purpose of which they're actually announced that scheme.
Okay, from Hannah in Victoria, in what scenarios can we legally ask for our staff members' vaccination status, if it's mandated or prior?
Yeah, for sure. And that's a really great question. I think it depends on what your position is as a business about whether you're requiring them to be vaccinated or not. If you're not requiring them to be vaccinated, then you arguably have no real reason to ask for their vaccination status, and we would rather you not ask for health information unless you've got a particular business reason to do so. So I would say answer that first question in terms of whether you're requiring vaccinations, and then only if that's yes, and you think that's lawful, would you then go through and actually ask for their status? If the position changes in Victoria and say, for example, you actually need to know whether your employees are vaccinated for them to go to a gym or go on site, then you will need that information. But hopefully we'll get more guidance from government in terms of how we are meant to collect that information and what's the easiest way to do that. So it's a little bit of a wait and see at the moment.
Okay, from Fiona, I'm needing to recruit new staff to replace unvaccinated staff to open. Am I required to reinstate permanent part-time staff, or can I dismiss them as I've replaced them with new staff? Is this considered fair or unfair dismissal?
So I definitely recommend reaching out and talking about this a bit more detail, because it is actually very tailored to your situation. It will depend on exactly how, for example, if they were let go in the first instance, how that took place, whether they're a current employee or not. There's no obligation to rehire ex-employees if they're no longer with the business, but again, it will really depend on what's their current connection to the business and how that applies. So yeah, again, definitely recommend reaching out for some more tailored info.
Question from Louise on the Fair Work Commission. Can we take any comfort to trust the process given the decision this morning, or is it likely to be based on the individual commissioner who is reviewing a case?
It's a really good point. It will be based on the commissioner kind of reviewing that case. As with any litigation, it can depend on who's actually hearing that matter, but we can take comfort from it. It is a decision that supports an employer's ability to direct a vaccination in certain situations. So there is that comfort level. I would just flag though that it is in relation to the flu vaccine, not COVID-19. And so while it can give comfort, it actually doesn't provide that kind of silver bullet to allow us to do it. So I think keep watching this space, keep looking out for decisions, but it's not a black and white issue at the moment.
Okay, where can I get more information on the no-fault COVID-19?
And this sounds a bit silly, but it's simply Google. So that's how I find it. If you type that into Google and look at the federal government's website, it will come up with information. And there is this press release that has come out in relation to the indemnity schemes as well. So definitely can't just provide the link right now, but if you Google it, it should come up. And if you can't, then please just contact me and I can send it through to you. Okay, from Rachel, what about if I ask employees to be vaccinated and they sustain an injury or worse death as a result of the vaccination? So in terms of the cost part of that, if there are adverse actions, then this government scheme is meant to cover that. And we are talking about a situation that I've never heard actually happen in terms of an employee getting a direction and then suffering that adverse action for those circumstances. It may be, and we haven't seen it yet, it may actually come under your workers' compensation legislation and your insurance for that if they can connect it to the workplace. I think we will see some workers' comp claims come through in relation to the COVID-19 vaccine because it's really connected to work potentially, but so it should be covered by that. So it shouldn't be something that you then personally face. But we just don't know yet in terms of how we're going to see those come through. So it might be, goes through the government scheme. It might be that they come under your workers' comp scheme, but you should have those protections. So it is just, I guess, further support to double check you've got workers' comp insurance and make sure that's covered, because there is a potential that people may come through and claim through you for that.
What if a member doesn't want to share private medical information? Who's responsible? Are there fines?
So a member in terms of, say, a customer, for example, it again might depend on Demetrio's answer before. Not sure if you want to jump in, Demetrio.
Yeah, so if a customer doesn't want to and you're required to understand that, so similar to the employee situation. So if there is a mandate or a direction by chief health officers that you are required to only have vaccinated people, then you can ask that. You then though need a mechanism in place to deal with that sensitive information. We don't have much clarity at the moment around whether the Service New South Wales or Service Victoria apps will directly talk to and provide the information that businesses need, and kind of a green pass equivalent, if you like. But that's something that no doubt will come out. Let's not forget it was only yesterday that New South Wales came out with their suggested roadmap in terms of the unvaccinated from the 1st of December. So there's still quite a lot of work to go from there.
Yeah, and that's a good segue to Chantel's question about can unvaccinated gym members exercise with our PTs before the 1st of December? Well, they can only do that under the lockdown conditions within the group. I'd like to know if a business requires staff to be vaccinated, then surely they must also ensure everyone who goes into that site is also vaccinated. Is this correct?
So it will depend on kind of what government directions are in place in terms of who can enter your site. So if, for example, the government says that only vaccinated people can come on to your site, then it is correct that they'll also need to be vaccinated. But we are going to see businesses potentially enforce vaccination requirements for their employees only, and make sure that they're protected and they're doing everything they can to protect their employees, given that they have that contact with the public. But it may be in those situations they don't require it from the users or the people coming into that site. So it will kind of depend, but it may be a situation where you reasonably are requiring employees to get it, but not gym users or members.
Okay, so does the current New South Wales guidelines for vaccinated staff and patrons in fitness centres reopen at 70% equate to a government mandate?
Yeah, so that roadmap is the government mandate. So that is a government direction. So those are, as Demetrio said, effectively law in terms of what we must follow. And there are consequences if we breach those. They aren't recommendations. They're what we actually just need to do as business owners.
Yeah, from Josh. So the mechanism to monitor compliance via QR code is only till December, when vax, non-vax can then access a gym when we hit the high vaccination rates. The restriction mechanism is mainly between now and then. To clarify, as Fitness Australia recommendations in regard to mechanisms that would satisfy our responsibilities in a 24/7 model. Josh, if you want to contact us offline, there are some things that we've got in place and we're still discussing. So happy to go through those in a bit more detail with you. The employer should be able to provide work health and safety data around these vaccines. Is this happening?
It's not on, so it's an interesting point. It's not on the employer to provide any information about vaccine 19 in any vaccines about the COVID-19. Sorry, it's actually just all on the government and health practitioners to do that. That's their role. It's definitely not on employers to actually provide our own opinion or our own information. I really recommend that they are just passed on to the federal government's website on vaccines. There's a number you can call on vaccines as well. I'd rather them get their information from those sources and not us.
Okay, from Lynn, regard to New South Wales regulations with only vaccinated people allowed, is this a rigid rule or up to the business owner? I have seen gyms announce they're opening to everyone. If this is up to us, or do we have to abide by the state's orders? I think you guys have made that very clear that they risk a fine if they don't abide by the health orders until December the 1st. Is that safe?
Yeah, safe to say. And it's also like, what are your responsibilities under the current directions? You've got to realise that. And then also what type of business you want to be known for after. And so certainly we've seen a whole bunch of businesses say, we're not going to follow it, etc. Well, that's fine, but they need to then be aware of the potential consequences. And whether you agree with that or not, that is just a reality. There are some very large fines and penalties being imposed and issued at the moment. And so you just need to be aware of that.
Okay, a question from Anita. I don't have any employees. I operate on my own. I'm not wanting to be vaccinated if not mandated. What are my rights as an individual business?
Yeah, so under the current rules, depending on which state, you could still do some training. There is no requirement for vaccinated only at the moment, but obviously in the roadmap that was released yesterday, then that does change, at least until December. Certainly post-December, like Andrew said, there are no clear directives at the moment. So it could be a matter that you kind of just have to wait and see or stick it out, and certainly then train members in a post-December environment.
From Nikki, when members want to see evidence of trainer vaccination status, what is the legalities around the privacy for this?
Yeah, so I think you just say as a business owner, you are complying with the laws, and the laws require you to only employ vaccinated staff or have vaccinated staff on site, at least for the period of that roadmap. So a member doesn't have direct access to that, but you as an employer have the responsibility to provide surety to the member that you are complying with the directions. So that's probably the difference there. So by virtue of you doing the right thing, then the member needs to take that on. And if the member doesn't trust or respect that you've done the right thing, then that is a matter for them. But ultimately, you've got to be in that position.
Question from Kate here about the double dose vaccination by the 11th of October in New South Wales. My understanding is they do have to be double dosed to be able to be inside the gym.
That's right.
And if they've got a medical certificate for an exemption, that qualifies. I'm not sure about a religious exemption for not getting the vaccine. Do you guys know anything about those at all?
No, so the only exemptions I'm seeing in different states are medical exemptions. They're not related to any other protected attribute.
Yeah. Okay. In accordance with the Australian Immunisation Handbook, we must provide valid consent to the procedure vaccine. This must be in absence of pressure coercion. I think that's a statement. Andrew, do subcontractors fall under a different category under employment law regarding double vaccinations?
In terms of the different government mandates, they don't necessarily fall under, say, an exemption. But in terms of your freedom or ability to direct them to get a vaccine will potentially change. So we can normally require contractors to do different things than we can from our employees, and the risks are generally lower. So it could make a distinction from that perspective, but it won't. It doesn't mean that we can just freely go out and require it from contractors compared to employees.
Okay, and with the double dose, does that apply in New South Wales to those under 16? I might have to take that on notice, guys.
Yeah, you want to notice, yeah.
Yep. From Lynn, regarding who has actually been held responsible, certainly in New South Wales, the politicians are talking about passing responsibility onto the individual, not the business. And we're trying to get that confirmed or clarified. So Lynn, please keep checking our social media. We'll update that. As a sole trader and outdoor personal trainer, am I simply bound to the state's public health officer?
Yeah, you are bound by the directives, absolutely. So, like we said before, whilst they're not legislation, you do take those directives seriously, and they are, of course, there are penalties that are imposed for not following them. So, whilst we may disagree with them, they are, for all intents and purposes, penalties that do apply if you don't follow.
To Mitch, as I said before, at this stage, it looks like the liability is going to fall on the individual, not the business, but we're still trying to get that confirmed. From Carmen, is it possible to have an unvaccinated person join a vaccinated group if the group is prepared to accept them?
If it goes against the directive, even if the group is prepared, then you could face a penalty. And ultimately, it's who polices this, who reports it, and it's your responsibility as a business to ensure that you comply with those rules. So whilst everyone may disagree, I mean, you could have all your members say, we don't care whether people are vaxxed or non-vaxxed. That actually isn't good enough. You still then need to comply with the health order directives. So even if there is an agreement, I wouldn't do so myself. The other side, just on that, there's been a few questions around the kind of mandatory policy or putting in place some form of policy. We do have a template, and what we can do is just share that with the slides later on for people to access, which of course can be tailored, and you can just go through that and work your way through it.
Okay, how can an employer demand vaccination status without the employee's consent? Does that not contravene privacy laws?
We've gotten information through from the particular regulator that you can request it and require it if it's reasonable, and that will again come back to that reasonable lawful direction. So there is that exemption. So yes, you're right. Normally you do need the consent, but because of these particular things in place, if it's a reasonable request, then you can require it.
Okay, a question here from Callum. How does federal law interact with state law on these directives? Does federal law trump any state directive?
Not directives, no. So again, chief health officers are kind of all state-based. Those directives are state-based, and there have been lots of challenges. We obviously see border challenges that have taken place, and no doubt there are going to be some more border challenges, and that is where the intersection between federal and state comes to play. But certainly, for all intents and purposes, we are all currently bound by state chief health officer orders rather than federal.
And I guess, Dee, as the federal government is not stepping up in terms of making any decisions about mandatory or otherwise, that probably puts it back into the state jurisdiction.
Yeah, it does indeed. And it's kind of obviously one of the challenges that we have with a federated model, which probably hasn't come to the forefront previously in Australian history for many years until we've had this divide thanks to COVID-19.
Okay, I think we've covered this one from Phil. When the word employee is used, does it also cover subcontractors who invoice the gym for services?
Yeah, it does. And it'll include anyone who might be, renting. I mean, we know traditionally in PT world that, people may be just renting from a space. You obviously have the same obligation as a business owner to those who are just renting or in your space.
Does a business have to ask every time their clients when they enter? I guess that would come down to the way they're recording the information the first time.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, absolutely. So again, we don't quite know the intersectionality yet between the various service apps and MyGov, but certainly I would expect that just like a person will be required to check in every time they come into the gym, they will be required to give a tick of approval in terms of their vaccination.
Can a gym legally put in a mandatory COVID-19 vaccination for members in place for a small gym? Can members sue us for doing that?
Yeah, so that's the business decision. Obviously, if you decide to make that business decision, then it could impact your members, and you may have some challenges in terms of your current membership. But certainly something that you could put in place in moving forward for your future members. So you would need to consider obviously your terms and conditions and how you would do that. But ultimately, as a business owner, you can make some of these decisions. Yes, there are always risks around discrimination, etc., which obviously you want to be aware of. However, certainly under the current rules, that is a mandate, and it's not you could not be sued for not allowing an unvaccinated person on your premises, because that's currently what the rules mandate.
If an individual is asked by a police officer to show their vaccination status, is that legal?
We probably shouldn't go down that rabbit hole, to be honest.
Okay.
Certainly not the topic for kind of what today is. And if there is no obligation, if you're certainly in an environment, so the obligations on so for example, a member comes to a gym, your obligation as a gym owner is to ensure that everybody there is vaccinated. Well, that's your responsibility as a gym owner. What police may or may not do with your customers or your members is certainly a matter between them and the police, and obviously your involvement, but you will need to show that you've done all you can do to ensure that that person was vaccinated whilst on your premises.
Yeah, and there's a question here, what happens if a person sort of presents with fake documentation? I think that goes back to the situation that the government, certainly in New South Wales, is implying that the individual is going to be responsible. So if you accept a vaccination certificate and you have fair reason to believe it's a valid one, then you should be okay on that basis.
Yeah, also, Barry, I just want to re-highlight a point that I made earlier, which is the reality is almost 90% of people are on the, we're pretty much there in terms of kind of having, so it is really a minority. Don't be making so many exemptions or issues around that minority. It is potentially 10%. And we don't know where the figure will land in terms of those being vaccinated. But as Andrew also did float, we'll find that most people will just be required. I mean, in order to go to a restaurant, in order to get onto an aeroplane, you are going to be required to be vaccinated. So it's not a unique circumstances just for gyms. It's certainly something that or for fitness businesses more broadly, it's something that's going to impact our lives more generally. And so whether people want it or not want it, we'll find that actually most people will end up getting it anyway. So yeah, let's not overcomplicate it. And whilst it absolutely is important to navigate some of these kind of quite hurdles, and again, like Andrew said, the rules are changing every single day, so keeping up on top of that is really important. But let's look at the other side of it, which is actually the current vaccination rates, so that a vast majority of people across the country are and will be getting vaccinated.
So after the 1st of December, when gyms open to everybody, regardless of status, vaccination status, what does that mean for employees? Does a requirement for an employee vaccination still stand?
Yeah, so it's a great question. We'll need to see kind of what exactly the requirements are for those different dates. So we're not fully aware of that right now. It may be that as a gym, you've still gone ahead with your own mandatory vaccination policy that might still apply to your employees after that date, or it might not. And that's based on your decision now and going through that process. But we'll know more when the government knows more and tells us in relation to that post date.
How do you suggest or ask our members if they are vaccinated?
Yeah, so I'm happy to jump in here again. It's ultimately, we don't have that direction or kind of some further information yet, but we do suspect that there's going to be some form of intersectionality between the Service New South Wales and Victoria apps, and certainly any other service apps that each government has, and the MyGov kind of vaccination record. So I suspect it'll be a digital version of approval, which obviously will work out how we can help businesses meet their responsibilities under the new roadmap rules.
Okay, has there been any indication Victoria will follow New South Wales in setting a date to remove the different rules for vaccinated and non-vaccinated? Well, Andrews did say yesterday that he is going to watch the New South Wales situation and learn what lessons can be learnt from there. And I'm assuming on that basis, if it works here, it'll flow through to Victoria, possibly at a later date.
It is likely that Victoria will follow suit in some form, as we've seen. It's just a matter of when. And again, we've said it a few times today, but these rules are changing literally every hour. And we have a press conference in the morning, and then we see the the media statements in the afternoon. We see the directives the day after. So things are taking time. And another good example of this is the rental relief stuff. We obviously went through that a couple of weeks ago, but the decision around rental relief was made in a press conference some 6 weeks ago. It then took another 4 weeks before we even got any form of regulation or further information from government. So again, completely appreciate that this is a moving topic and something that is changing every single day. And we certainly do our best to kind of provide additional information. And I know you as well, Barrie, and certainly on all your socials, keeping people up to date. And certainly that's the best that we can do. But I'm just conscious of time, so we might just maybe one other kind of question or theme, Barrie, and then we might have to wrap it up for today.
Yeah, okay. And just for advice of those who are watching this and not going to get to your questions, we will be doing an update, particularly on Victoria and New South Wales on Friday around lunchtime. So there'll be plenty of time then to get through those questions. I'm just trying to find one which we haven't sort of covered in general. If a gym has a creche, do the people who work in the creche need to be vaccinated?
That's a great question. I don't believe we have any directives at the moment around that, but I would assume they're on premise, and yes. But again, that's just an assumption at the moment without having kind of any specific detail around what governments may require for kind of creches, childcare workers, etc. I don't believe there is currently a requirement for childcare workers to be vaccinated, but there was some discussion, or maybe that's true, Andrew, you may know.
Yeah, sorry, it just came in through very, very recently. Early childcare have been brought into some of the requirements in Victoria that have been attached to teachers. So there are actually some upcoming dates that childcare workers need to be vaccinated if they fall under that definition. So again, maybe recommend just following through and seeing how your creche is classified and whether you fall under that in Victoria. Otherwise, yeah, I'm not aware of any other states that have their own requirements.
I think it's highly likely, Andrew, that childcare will be picked up nationally in the mandatory regime. The question that I'd have for Tanya, who has posed this question, is the service that's been provided licensed under the Childcare Act, or is it a creche like baby minding, babysitting service?
Yeah.
If it's licensed under the Childcare Act in Victoria, you'll need to have your staff vaccinated. If it's a creche, it's not quite so clear.
Yeah.
Okay, look, I know we've got a lot of unanswered question here, and I apologise for that. There was also a suggestion that we do another one of these when we get a bit closer to reopening in Victoria, which I think would be really worthwhile, because there will be some lessons learned from New South Wales. Thanks, Andrew. Thanks, Luke. Apologies to all those people that didn't get their questions answered. We will endeavour to get as many as we can answered out of session, but also just to remind you that on Friday there will be an update. And as both Dee and Andrew have said, this is literally changing on a day-to-day basis, sometimes on an hour-by-hour basis, as politicians and policymakers make decisions in response to various situations.
Yeah.
Thanks again, Andrew. Thank you, Dee.
Great, thanks, Barrie. Really appreciate it.
Be able to tap into your expertise.
Thanks, everyone. I appreciate your time.
Thank you.